plan to kind of pick up where we left off at the last meeting, but I know we had a few people here who weren't at the last meeting. Just by a show of hands, how many people were not here for an initial meeting back in May? A pretty good number of folks. Thank you for joining us, and we'll share more at the end about what's coming next. We do have one more session planned, and hopefully folks who weren't able to be here at that initial meeting were able to watch the video or look through the notes and the presentation and get some information about what we shared at that meeting. A similar format tonight. We're going to share some information and then open it up to any questions that folks may have. And I see Joe Martin coming in. So Joe, as board president, do you want to do a quick greeting and then we'll turn things over to Ross?
Yeah, apologies everyone. I'm running a couple minutes later than I hoped, but I hope this is welcome back for most of you. If it's not, if we have some new people in the room, we're glad you could join us. And I don't know what Rich alluded to, but if you're here for the second go around, you kind of know the format and what we're going to do. If you're joining us for the first time, second in a series of 3 meetings. First meeting was a little of the big picture stuff about state finance and school finance and how that impacts schools in general. Tonight is dialing it into Milton a little bit, and Ross McPherson, our business director here, is going to show us revenue calculation worksheets, those kinds of things, and what the state does and what we do locally, how that impacts building a budget and some of those pieces to that. So I want to reiterate, not a normal school board meeting format at all. We want this to be interactive, and please, raise your hand or wait for a pause in the conversation. If you've got a question, we'd like to address it and get you an answer. We got some specific questions last time that asked for actual dialed-in numbers. And Ross and Rich are both hesitant to do those we really want to be accurate. So if we want to give you a piece of data, we will certainly get you that. But if it's not on the tip of their tongue, rest assured it's numbers that we can find or we can get, but we may not be able to reiterate them tonight based on looking up the actual hard numbers. So bear that in mind. So ask questions, we'll get you the answers as best we can. We'll either get back to you individually, work them into the next meeting or this meeting if we can. And one thing I wanted to point out, just so you're aware, our goal with the 3 meeting sequence is not to get you all to come to a consensus. Hopefully that wouldn't happen anyway. You've all got different viewpoints and you bring a different piece of our community to the discussion. That's what we want. And the school board wants to wants to digest and weigh all of that into whatever framework we use moving forward, building our budget, talking about potential solutions, those kinds of things. So share your thoughts. We want them. We want to be able to dialogue with or incorporate that into our thought and planning process. But we are not expecting folks to come to some sort of a conclusion or any kind of a single solution, if you will. So please bear that in mind. So other than that, welcome or welcome back, whichever is the case. And I don't know if you have more, Rich, or
just one more thing that I want to add, Charlie, if you want to flip to the next slide here. I'm not going to take time to go through these again, as you were saying that we looked at last time, but we do want to highlight many of the great things that are happening across our school district. We work really hard, all of our staff at all of our schools and all of our departments work really hard to provide high quality education for students and great opportunities for students within the resources that we have available. Folks that were here last time heard me talk about finding that balance between high student achievement and being fiscally responsible for our taxpayers. And both of those things are very important for us. When Joe spoke a minute ago about there's not an expectation that everyone is going to reach consensus here, sometimes it's because people weigh those two things differently. Some people might say, I don't care how much my taxes are, student achievement has to be the most important thing. And there are other people who might say, my taxes are the most important thing. And we're not here to judge those beliefs, and it certainly is likely to depend on your personal situation. But we understand that we have a responsibility as a school district to do both of those things well, and we feel that we have and continue to do both of those things very well. Carly, if you want to flip to the next slide. So for a little bit of review of the first meeting, but the main part of this meeting is looking at funding data for the School District of Milton. At that first meeting, we talked about the state system for funding public education. Now it's what impact does that system have on School District of Milton, both for now and moving forward. We'll talk a little bit about our tax levy and our mill rate, and our composition of our budgetary dollars, how we utilize the revenue that we get from the state. And I'm going to turn it over to Ross to review a couple of the things from the last meeting.
Sure. So once again, welcome to everyone here. I want to start by going through some of the topics from last time, especially for the benefit of those who weren't with us last time. But the last time we were here, we reviewed the Wisconsin school funding system and what remains from the model created in the early 90s. We discussed that revenue limits still control a district's main source of revenue, but that limits have fallen approximately $3,300 behind the rate of inflation on average. We also looked at local data to show examples of differences in per pupil funding and how this creates a system of haves and have-nots. For the past few years, districts have used federal stimulus funds in place of state revenues. With that funding now expiring, many districts are encountering fiscal cliffs. And finally, we talked about how the state aid itself is calculated and that the state's portion of school funding remains inconsistent since the removal of the 2/3 funding commitment in the original funding model. Before we jump into some kind of local flavor, I want to just put not a warning, but just a blanket statement that we are going to get into hockey talk and numbers bits. So I will do my best not to lose folks, but again, that's why we encourage people to ask questions. I will be the first person to admit that the K-12 funding system is needlessly complex. I'm hopefully here to help explain some of the finer points. So before we move on, Rich, I know you want to talk a little bit about the enrollment history.
Yeah, one thing that plays a part in our funding is our enrollment and what our enrollment trends are. So this is just a list going all the way back to fall of 2010. Each September, every school district in the state turns in their enrollment numbers to the state. It's the third Friday in September count. You can see this fall of 2023 was our count from this past year. And preschool special education and 4K are kind of separated from kindergarten through 12th grade. But then you can see for each of those years how many K-12 students we have, how many we project for this coming fall, and what that changes has been from year to year, and what that looks like at each of our levels, at K3, at 4th through 6th grade, at 7th and 8th grade, and at 9 through 12, and what's our total for all K-12 and the 4K and preschool. So one of the things that we see, even though there's some ups and downs over time, you can see it decreases are in parentheses, increases are not. Our enrollment has stayed pretty stable, actually really stable over time. And a lot of school districts across the state aren't seeing that. The other thing that you'll notice is that we typically graduate a lot more students than we've been bringing in as kindergartners. And that's a trend across the state and across the country. Families are having fewer children, they're waiting longer to have children. So you can see, for example, in 2022, so not the school year that just got done, but the one before that, we graduated 280 seniors and we brought in 232 kindergartners. So that's almost 50 students that we're losing. And that's the biggest impact on our enrollment from year to year, is how many kids graduate and how many new kindergartners come in. But we make up that number. You can see, even though we graduated 280 and brought in 232 kindergartners, our enrollment still went up by 39 students. We typically add some students at grades 7 and 9 from private schools each year. And we also have been picking up more families moving into the district during the course of the school year or over the summer, and more families choosing to attend here, either families that live in another district and open enroll in, or fewer families that live in our district and open enroll out. So compared to a lot of other districts, our enrollment, I would call it very stable enrollment, and we anticipate that to stay in that range. I think I saw a question in the back.
Claire, when you compare that to like statewide, as you mentioned, Hope Janesville, Hope Milton, you didn't mention Janesville, but this area has stayed relatively stable compared to other districts. do you know around about the time you saw falling enrollment statewide? Is there a time where it's like, 2015 you really saw it start to, or is it different for every district?
I think it's been coming for a while. If you look at demographic trends statewide, the smaller families and waiting longer to have kids has been a trend for quite a while. And it's starting to hit schools, but it's not something that happened suddenly.
I'll add to that. The Applied Populations Lab out of Madison has been publishing data. I've worked with them in the past, and there is a noticeable change in birth rates in the last decade or so. Most noticeably, they identified that in 2017, the birth rate started to decline across the state in many areas. So that is a known stat as well.
And I think I saw one other question.
I was just gonna ask about the 0-3 data, how that was trending,
Yep.
so
It's still down, and I could see, you could argue it's even more suppressed since COVID, but we'll see.
and these, Rich, this is, I'm gonna ask this question, this is the rainbow sheet, this is butts and seats, right?
Yes.
Numbers, it's not our DPI.
This is the number of students in classes, or as Kim refers to it, as butts and seats.
Or the rainbow sheet.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
All right, so let's get right into it. Let's talk about revenues for Milton. The reason we talk so much about the revenue limits is that per pupil categorical aid and the revenue limit itself comprise about 89% of our operating revenue for our main general fund. That remaining 10% comes from a combination of federal sources and other things like open enrollment, as we just mentioned, categorical aid programs, and student fees. Here's another way to look at this breakdown in our general fund. The two largest pieces of this pie come from state and local sources. The largest piece, in purple, represents state sources. This represents things like equalization aid, categorical aids, and any state grants that we participate in. The second largest, in blue, represents local sources. This includes our local tax levy. Things like student fees and activity income. The slice in red represents open enrollment payments and any local grant cooperatives that we participate in. In this piece, I do want to point out that this 8% is almost entirely from open enrollment resources. We will revisit this later when we talk about open enrollment on the other side of the equation. The final and smallest portion in light blue represents our federal sources. This is from our any federal grants or Medicaid program revenue we receive throughout the year. With the expiration of ESSER funding, this piece has returned to and will likely stay a very minimal portion of its operating revenue in the near future.
Yes, Ross, Dave Holterman. One of the things in the first meeting was the kind of divergence between the rate of inflation in funding and the actual level of funding. Do you know, if you would have taken this snapshot 20 years ago or some period of time ago, I'm assuming based on that 55% that is state funding would have been 65 or 70 or something along those lines.
Statewide, yes.
Yes, right. Do you know approximately what the number would have been versus what it is today?
Yes, if you go back to something I mentioned in the first meeting, we talked about this 2/3 state funding commitment. So if this were a Milton pie, this was a state of Wisconsin pie, that purple portion would be closer to 2/3 or 66% of our operating resources. Right now, statewide, it's closer to 54. And that number has been on the decline since 2003 when that provision was removed. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Furthermore, when you're citing Medicaid, and this is probably a technical question that you can follow up with me on, but the legislature allowed in the most recent biennial budget to allow for school districts to be able to bill into Medicaid additional billing codes. Has that impacted a little bit on that with the resources being able to be for billable services in, like, particularly the mental health component of it?
Not mental health, but the component that we recognize in Medicaid is still a relatively small portion of our budget. So when we talk about the 49 out of 50 million we're in our operating budget right now, Medicaid still fits within that 1% slice, even with what we claim. Okay. All right. It is, so one other thing I wanted to mention is it's clear from the last slide that we are getting most of our revenues from state and local sources. But as we think about the revenue limit and some of the other topics we're gonna mention tonight, the consistency of the split in our revenue limit between these is part of the balancing act that can make budgetary planning very difficult. During the 21-23 state budget, there was a $0 growth per pupil in the revenue limit calculation. This means that when the state increased their aid contribution to K-12 districts, their portion of a number that was held flat increased during those 2 years. During the 23-25 state budget, after the low revenue ceiling increase, their contribution as a portion of the whole fell again. So it's like the accordion of how we want to consider a percentage of the whole in each year on this graph. This is also complicated by the fact that when we talk about equalization aid and the split between local and state sources in the revenue limit, equalization aid is based on prior year activity. So our spending in 1 year is used to determine how much aid we get in the following year. So even with that discrepancy continues to wax and wane over time. So it eventually falls to the district to attempt to control our tax levy when this kind of thing happens due to the inconsistency. Oh, excuse me. There's one other component completely outside of school revenue limits that complicates this a bit more. The state has a program that we haven't talked about yet called the School Levy Tax Credit. This program issues credits through the Department of Revenue to municipalities based on actual school district levies. The reason I bring this up is this is commonly considered part of K-12 school aids when we talk about it in the state budget. During the 23-25 state budget, the credits that were put into this program were more than was put into the general aid pool. So this waxing and waning I just talked to, where the contribution of our revenue limit is now falling again, this tax credit never actually hits our district. And that doesn't actually come in as revenue any time. There is a slide at the end of this deck if we have time to kind of go through it in more detail, how that state appropriation has changed. All right, so let's get right into the tax levy itself. Each year, when the district puts together a tax levy proposal to the Board of Education and the public, we levy for 4 distinct things. We levy for operations, which is our revenue limit levy comprised of funds 10, 38, and 41, which are internal codes, but this slide. Our debt service, if there is any, community services, if there is any, and any prior year considerations if applicable. Quick note on that, on the far right where you see this prior year levy chargeback and other, every once in a while a district is allowed to levy for unpaid taxes in the prior year. So for clarity's sake, I want to just mention it, but it doesn't come up as often as you think. These amounts combine to create the total school levy that the board approves each year in the fall as part of budget development. When we talk about our tax levies, we reference what is called the mill rate, or tax rate per $1,000 of property value. This is created by taking the total school levy, dividing it into the total equalized property value within the district, and multiplying it by 1,000. For the 23-24 school year, the Milton School District mill rate is $7.49.
Could you go
Yes.
back to that? How did you get the 22 million? Well, how do you get to that number?
22 million? That is the total school levy between what we levy for operations, so the purple box here, plus the.
Oh, I see, I heard that.
Oh.
I apologize.
No, that's fine. Any other questions? Okay. Over the past 5 years, the district has worked to maintain a balance between total tax increases and mill rate impact during some significant inflationary changes in property levy. Our total tax levy increase has remained below the rate of inflation, and our tax rate has been declining during the same period. So on the bottom, this is a lot of numbers. I warned you there'll be talk. But to your question, Mike, the difference in the school levies from the general fund or the total revenue limit levy, which has a subtotal here, the referendum approved debt service in Fund 39, which is our recent capital referendum, and the community service levy, which is our maintenance of our city Central Park and Shilbert Park, add up to the totals of the total school-based levy. The percentage change year over year is listed below that, and our change in total equalized property value and our mill rate over the last 5 years is listed here as well. And keep in mind, all these presentations will be posted for a review if we have things that come up after tonight. Any other questions? Okay.
I'm going to pause on that slide just for
Sure.
a second. I want to make sure that that 22 million that Mike asked about is here. And when Ross talked about the different figures that make that up, you can see those listed here. The 16,817,168 is our revenue limit levy. And then the two other parts that get added to that, the referendum approved debt service is a 5,445,000, and then community service is 404,000. And that's what makes up that total of the amount that's levied to our local taxpayers.
Yes.
Did I hear you right earlier? You said this is Dan Ford.
Yes.
Did I hear you right earlier when you said that if you don't use the total tax levy in 1 year, that could negatively impact the amount of revenue that you receive from the state the following year? Is that right?
No. So are you talking about levying to the maximum available to us?
Yeah.
No, if you don't use it, there's no penalty. If you were to over levy, which would have to be deliberate, then yes. But that doesn't happen very often.
What was the exact example that you gave then? I must have misunderstood, where if you don't spend a certain amount 1 year, that it could impact you negatively in terms of revenue the following year. Or did I misunderstand?
Was that tonight, Zipper?
Yeah.
I think if you went back, go back to the previous slide, it's the prior year levy chargeback.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm thinking way too far. Yes, so if, for example, the Department of Revenue were to notify us as we're developing our fall budget that our collection was short for our tax payments in the spring. So we get 2 tax payments, we get our first bit in January, then we get the rest in the spring, June-ish. If that last payment that we're expecting is short, the Department of Revenue will tell us why we're short and that we are able to levy an additional $30,000, making that up, based on prior years. So that money is owed based on prior levy certification, but never paid. So in those situations, we are allowed to levy back for those amounts.
Okay.
But no, there's no penalty. It's just a recognition that in some circumstances, taxes go unpaid from 1 year to the next.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So let's switch gears to expenditures and how they're broken down in general. The largest component of our general fund is represented by salaries and wages. The largest piece here in blue, I'm going to check my colors to make sure it's translated to blue, represents actual wages from salaries, hourly wages, and seasonal staff. The orange portion represents employee benefits, including healthcare, employer taxes, and retirement costs. The green segment identifies purchase services, and I want to pause here for a second because the list here is intentionally created. These are actually in descending order of total cost within that slice. So the top one here is open enrollment. We mentioned before about the revenue side how open enrollment appears on both sides. For those students that come into the district from other districts, we receive a revenue per pupil, open enrollment. The same is true when students that live within our district attend elsewhere. We are currently in a situation in Milton where we are taking in slightly more students than are enrolling elsewhere. So, and for the most part, over the last several years, we've been fairly stable in that regard. There are many districts throughout the state where that is not the case, where they are very heavily weighted one way or the other. This can have a significant effect on how districts run their programming, because if there's a number of districts that are counted in our account for aid purposes, but they attend elsewhere, we're going to be, in essence, cutting a check to DPI to distribute that to where those students are attending. Beyond that, we have our cost of transportation, maintenance and utilities on our buildings, substitutes, which arguably is still within our wages and benefit structure when we talk about total compensation in our general fund. Our voucher programs, which we act as a taxing pass-through for students that attend private parochial schools that the School District of Milton would then levy for and pay to based on state mandates. And finally, when we get down to the smaller portions of this pie, we get down to software and other agreements we have with entities that we work with. The purple identifies our fund transfers. We have 2 main fund transfers in our general fund. One is to special education. This is important because our special education costs as a district and statewide are reimbursed at roughly 30%. So the rest of that needs to be made up from the general fund and then our revenue limit. So we fund about 70% of our special education budget through our revenue limit revenues. If any of you follow the state budget, you'll know this has been a hot button topic. There's been a lot of discussion about moving that threshold over time, and it hasn't really made any significant changes in the last 5 or 10 years, arguably longer. The other transfer we have is in our long-term capital improvement fund.
I have a question, Mike.
Yes.
The fund transfers, it says wages and benefits. Are those different from the blue and red?
They are, because the portion that we're talking about in this 12% comprised of all the budgets with our special education fund, which most of that is also staff and their salaries and wages. I'm sorry, the long-term capital improvement fund, which is something that this district started roughly 5 years ago to start to internally fund some of our long-term capital needs. This is actually very beneficial program for districts like us to engage in, because it allows us to set aside some funding on an annual basis for those long-term investments. We can start to plan on roof sections, maintenance of grounds, things that need more attention that we may not be able to address once every 10 years when we have items such as a capital project come up like we just did.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
What is included, I'm not familiar, what is included in the special ed, like what makes up special education? Is that?
As far as what's in the budget for special ed, it looks very similar in structure to the general fund that we're looking at here. It is mostly staffed. There is large federal grants for IDEA, for these, for the American Disabilities Act coverage from many years ago.
Okay.
So we have federal grants for those purposes, but the majority of that goes into an aidable category for services like nursing, psych, social worker, guidance, cross-categorical teachers, OTPT, all student services that are addressed through non-direct instruction.
That would be like what is it, a 504?
Yes.
An IED, okay.
Right. IEP.
IEP, okay.
Individualized education.
Got it. And all of that is under the special education
That's correct.
umbrella. Got it.
That's correct.
I'm sorry to,
Yes.
I don't mean to harp on that topic as well, but I just I need some clarification on it as well. So all special education expenditures are in there, but did you have special education funding separated out on prior slides, or were those
Yes.
lumped into?
We're only
Okay.
talking here about the general fund. So the reason I'm talking about transfers on this slide is the dynamic I mentioned a few minutes ago. Our special education services are aided differently at the state level than our general instruction purposes. We have aidable categories for all the staff members I just mentioned, but the state reimburses us at about 30 cents on the dollar.
Sure.
So the balance of that, whatever the 70% of those services, staff, wages, what have you, we have to fund internally. So
Understood.
that comes out of this pie that we've been talking about
I
already.
guess I'm just clarifying that those students don't receive per pupil funding as well, lumped into the other categories.
It's all the same.
Yeah, okay.
There are other, like when you get to open enrollment mechanics, yes, there's some differences there, but for the most part, it's all the same count. Every student is counted the same way.
Okay.
This 1% slice here in light blue, or cyan if you prefer, represents the portion of our budget that goes towards our debts or leases. This includes things like technology hardware, our student and staff devices, and any short-term borrowing needs the district may have on an annual basis. This last slice here, which I put in another category, really is the everything else. This includes everything down to pencils we might use in our classrooms, to the technology hardware that we might use, printers, smart boards, screens that are funded, replaced, and used in a year. Any more questions on this one? Thank you for the question, by the way.
One quick thing, folks maybe have heard us refer to that about 75% of our overall expenses as a school district are for salaries and benefits. And if you just looked at this, you'd see, well, that's about 60% in the blue and the red. But, and you don't need to go back to this, Ross, but in the purchase services, the 22%, two of the areas that are listed there, some districts have that straight in their salaries and benefits. Because we don't hire people for these positions, we contract out with Go Right Way for transportation. So that's technically, it's salaries and benefits for the bus drivers, but it falls under this tab rather than these because they're not technically our employees. And we use a service called Teachers on Call for our substitutes, where other districts might hire their own substitutes or run their own bus program. So you may see, if you compare one district to another, you might see different totals in these groups because of if they're contracting out for some of those services or not. But it's pretty standard across the state that about 75% or somewhere in that range, about 75% of these school districts' costs are for people, for salaries and benefits for people.
Hey, Ross, can I just touch base just to kind of clarify, just because of my internal knowledge at the state level, is because I think there's some confusion with the categorical special aid and the per pupil component of it. And those are two competing things. So not only does the district get the per pupil aid, but they also get that special education. And the legislature did invest almost $100 billion additional into this past budget.
Right.
While it's still not at the level that everybody would love to see it at, there was an additional increase in that portion. Regarding that, and then also the increase when it came to the high cost for transportation and high cost special education as well. So I just want to make sure that's kind of clarified out for people that may not necessarily understand that.
Thank you. Here is another view of some of the factors that we review in the budget each year. This is similar to the numbers we had on the screen before, but it's a slightly different view, including our enrollment figures, as well as property growth and our total Fund 10 revenues and expenditures in a given year. One piece I want to highlight is how district operational revenues peaked in this 5-year view during the 21-22 school year due to ESSER funding. This also shows an intentional effort to address cash flow needs. As you can see, if you follow the difference between revenues and expenditures in a given year, what we've changed in our fund balance over time. This is intentional action by the administration and the board as we are trying as much as we can to avoid our short-term borrowing needs. If you recall from last session, many districts, including us most recently, are required to short-term borrow each year as we become cash poor by usually the end of September. That's due to the delay in how we receive most of our revenues. We've talked about state aid, we've talked about our tax levies itself. I mentioned this last time, but we get our tax bills in December. We get our first tax payments, half of it, in January. That's 6 months into our fiscal year. So we're operating on most of this budget with a significant portion of our revenues absent. Because of that, we become cash poor before the school year even starts. So many districts, including us, again, we are required to short-term borrow for cash flow purposes. We pay that back in 12 months. That is a standard practice. But our district is working very hard to maintain a fund balance between 20 and 25% purely for that reason. Not because this money sits here to be used on annual expenditures, because it literally is a one-time source. But this is getting closer and closer to the point where this past year we did not need a short-term borrow. And I anticipate doing that again this year, which is a phenomenal place to be. Wow. Because depending on what district you're in, you can pay anywhere from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest just paying back that loan every year. I'm going to stay on this slide before we move on because I know we have one more thing that I want Rich to come up on, but this is a lot to digest. And I mentioned at the beginning that this is needlessly complex, but these are some of the factors that we work with on an annual basis. We can come back to this as well, but if there are any questions, please let us know. Or you can pause on it and think about it, that's fine.
One thing, Ross, on this slide, you have that Fund 10 revenues circled at 50 million in 21-22. Do you want to speak to that?
Yes, the reason we peaked in those years is actually for a couple different reasons. ESSER funding being the biggest part of it. Obviously, 2020 affected the world very differently. But there were a series of 3 federal awards that came in the last 4 years that allowed districts to get some services back on track and try to plan for future budgets. The problem is a lot of that money came at the beginning of the need, and it was a one-time source of funding from the federal government. During the same 2 years, during the 21-23 state budget, there was no per pupil increase. Those zeros referenced on line 2 of those years. When that dropped off, the state did not refill all the funding that was in play during that 4-year period. So now, a lot of the reason we're having these meetings and talking about school funding in general is term fiscal cliff is going to keep coming out. Districts that were forced to use one-time revenue for operating purposes and on an ongoing basis are now running into some serious problems. This year, we had an increase in the state budget of $325 per pupil, which is, to be fair, the largest increase in the per pupil amount since revenue limits began. But as we've graphed and shown in the last session, this is still putting us at the end of the current state budget $3,300 behind the rate of inflation on the average, and we are not at the average. We are actually on the lower side of average in Milton. It also does highlight kind of the inconsistencies, and the reason I put the peak out is you can see how revenues have leveled off. And yes, this district has done a lot to maintain services and outperform our budget each year where we do have the margins listed on that surplus deficit line. But we also have things that we can start to do when we stay within our goal of 20 to 25%. We can aggressively pursue our active debt schedule, pay that off. We can put more into capital improvements. All these things are going to be on the table in the next couple of years because those needs aren't going away. We insure over $200 million worth of property in our buildings right now, and there's no way we can address it on an annual basis all the time.
Pause, you go back just for 1 second. I want to point out a couple things. A question came up about people's property taxes at the last meeting, and there's two things that seem to be or could be thought of as being at odds with each other. Our mill rate for our district, and this is not specific to each municipality in the district, it varies a little bit from one municipality to the next, but this is the overall mill rate for the district. In 2019-20 was $9.26. What that means for a $100,000 home, or for every $100,000 in value of your home, you pay $926 in property taxes to the School District of Milton. And you pay other property tax to other municipalities that you live within, your city and county, but the school district portion. And you can see for each of the 4 years after that, our mill rate has dropped to where it currently is $7.49. And you can see the impact on a $100,000 home, or for every $100,000 in your home. So you would think that that would mean that people's individual property taxes would be going down, but we know that that's not the case. Because property values have been increasing in some cases and in some places at a very high rate. What were you pointing out?
I was pointing out the property growth is on line 3 there.
So you can see, especially, and these are
fair, those were fairly regular figures.
fairly regular, but growing, and then all of a sudden, 22, 23, 17.5% property value increase, and this past year, 12.32% increase. And those increases are due to two different things. One is as there's more property, so if a house goes up or a new business opens, that increases the equalized value across our district. But if people's own property, existing property is assessed and it's assessed at a higher rate, that also increases that amount. So one of the things that we've worked hard to do is to try to be as fiscally responsible as we can. We, like all districts, we didn't see any increases in the per pupil funding for a couple of years, but we had the one-time COVID money. But we knew that was going to be going away. And we know that we have to work hard to live within our means. So I wanted to highlight a few things. This was a question that came up at the first meeting. So in professional development, we've worked to limit the number of outside speakers and utilize more of a train-the-trainer model, where we have experts in our district that will then provide training for other people in their group, whether it's teachers or counselors, administrators. So we utilize that model whenever possible. We've centralized our curriculum process so that, particularly at our K-3 schools, where in the past, each school or sometimes even each teacher would purchase curriculum that they wanted for their classroom. And we've made it more centralized so that every second grade student across our district, no matter which teacher they have or which school they're in, is getting taught the same things. We identify what those essential standards are, and then every student gets that same situation. For this current year that just finished, we reduced our school and department budgets by 5% as part of our budget cuts for last year. So our principals and directors had to look at how they could get by with less in their school and department budgets. A few years back, we built in attendance areas to reduce the number of bus routes, and that's had considerable savings for our transportation. With staffing, every year we align our staffing to enrollment changes. We don't need to go back to the enrollment slide, but one of the reasons that we track how many students we have and how many we're expecting at each of the different levels, so at K3 and 4-6, at the middle school for grade 7 and 8, and then the high school, is we look at if enrollment for that group is going up, we may need to add staff, and if enrollment for that group is going down from year to year, we need to reduce staff so that we can best live within our means. Anytime we have staff openings for the last couple of years, we have, whether it's from a retirement or a resignation, we review that position, see if we still need that position before we post it and we fill it. We've looked at salary increases of 2 to 3% with market adjustments if needed. And that ties back to one thing that we talked a little bit about at the last meeting, is that system that the state has set up really has haves and have-nots for school districts. Some school districts have a lot more resources than other school districts do, and they're able to better compete for staff. We've seen over the last few years very high inflation much higher than 2 to 3%. And our competition for people, whether it's for classroom teachers, for support staff, for administrators, competition has become much more intense. And many of you, if you run a business or work in private industry, do hire, or if you're involved in hiring at all in your organization, you probably have seen that too. There's more competition for people. We've tried to stay consistent and looked at salary increases in that 2 to 3% range. We've gone above that. If we've seen that the market requires us, if we're going to keep people, we need to go above that, but we've tried to stay with that as much as we can. We review our employee benefits annually, whether that's medical insurance, retirement, et cetera. We made a change moving from 2 options for our benefits eligible staff on medical insurance. We used to be with both Dean and Mercy and gave people an option, and we saved a considerable amount of money by moving to just one option for folks. We implemented a HSA option for our benefits eligible staff that both has been a positive for our employees and also for the school district. And we've had to make some changes to our retirement benefits for our staff. A few years back, we moved our 4K students into our schools to reduce lease costs. That's been an ongoing savings for the school district. And then this is a big part of what we utilized our one-time funds for. We addressed some needed facility needs, and some of those facility upgrades have saved us utility costs. We added a lot of space with our capital referendum a few years back. And even with adding that space and increasing utilities costs, because we've been able to make some energy efficient changes, our utilities budget has stayed relatively flat over that time because we've been thoughtful in how we utilize those one-time funds. And then we also undertake long-term facility planning so that we don't get surprises, so that our board and Stephen Shantz, our director of building and grounds, every year brings to our board both a 5-year and a 10-year plan on what's coming up down the road for our facilities, because we know that we can't just kick the can down the road for keeping our facilities upgraded too.
Mike Barron, I'm wondering, along with the facilities, is there a breakdown of expenditures per student at each school?
On a construction basis?
No, it's like how many students are at the school versus how much we expenditures, like for salary of teachers and upkeep of the building. Because I know that we have 4 elementary schools. I was kind of wondering.
I mean, those numbers exist.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I didn't think you'd have them.
No. But what's to?
So it's more, the facilities is that we have 4 elementary schools. So we need all 4. I just wondered.
I think that's a much larger question,
Yeah.
to be honest with you. But if you're talking about direct comparisons, the issue with that is you might have, or you do have, varying degrees of experience levels and teaching staff, longevity or otherwise, that would make direct comparisons to students close, but not the same if you were to do a straight line division between total cost of staff and students in those buildings.
Well, that's where I'd like, those would be numbers I'd like to see.
Actually, the DPI does publish report cards. There's a school level reporting we have been submitting. Well, the state has been submitting since about 17, 18. Those are on DPI's site that give you that kind of breakdown.
Okay.
I appreciate this slide. This has been helpful to show material impacts that you've taken to remain fiscally responsible. We've heard that the system creates haves and have-nots. And I'm wondering, you had a good slide the last time about, our Badger conference and who our favorite schools are. Oh, you had a slide there. Well, go back to the stats of the color.
The last is this one.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm just kind of wondering, what is an example of a school that's a have, or a handful of schools that are haves? And I'm interested as to how their funding aligns. And is it partially because are some of the schools that are haves, they were set at one of those, revenue limit levels that we talked about, which was set back in the 90s, so that they had a bigger part of the pie, but then we also have school districts now who have passed referenda. Maybe if it's recurring referenda, then they have it baked in for 5 years, and somebody suggested the last time those orange are gonna turn blue. So I'm just wondering, can you give us like a couple, what are the haves and why are they haves?
Ross, do you want to start with kind of reviewing this slide? Because we did have maybe
Sure.
about 10 or so people who weren't here last time, and I want to make sure that everybody understands
Sure.
what's
So say
happening.
goodbye to the colors. We're gonna go back to this one.
Sure.
So when we talk about the system, first of all, both of your examples are correct. When we talk about the revenue limit per pupil, you would think that districts had the same resources across district lines. Not the case. Not the case. And this goes back to a big topic we had in our first meeting that talks about when the revenue limits were created, they froze prior year activity going back to 91, 92, if I'm correct on that one, and did a straight line calculation on how much of that district spent in their general fund divided by their student population, and they got a number. That number became your new threshold that you would build on year after year in the revenue limit. The problem with that is districts had no warning this was gonna happen. It was all under development at the time, but we're talking 30 years ago, so I have to read some old stuff to get this history in my head. But districts that were in the middle of a expansion, building a new school, or whatever reason, might have had a threshold of, making this up, $7,500 per pupil back in the early 90s, compared to some districts that were just chugging along, and maybe they were spending $6,000. Those thresholds were frozen in time, and districts at the time turned around and went, wait, you did what? And all of a sudden, we had an annual increase per pupil. At the time, it was $200. That was indexed to inflation. I'm not going to rehash that entire conversation, but $200 each year means the first district now is at $7,700. The second district is at, what did I say, $6,200. And they're looking at each other and said, well, thank you for the increase, but there's still a $1,500 discrepancy between the two districts. Well, the state realized this almost immediately. And the year after revenue limits went into place, 2 things happened. They created something called the low revenue ceiling, which you've heard us mention a few times, and they established the ability for districts to have referendum. That became the big equalizer, or those 2 things became the great equalizer. When the low revenue ceiling was created, they looked at the district that was at 6,000 and said, okay, yeah, we made this happen, but now we have an equity issue with districts that were at the low end. They're never going to catch up. So they started a system by which they took the low revenue ceiling up higher than the $200 everyone else was getting. So the low revenue ceiling would jump every couple of years, say $300. And then you think, well, over time, okay, now they're starting to get closer in their lines. Well, that's contingent on the model continuing, which we've all been saying hasn't happened. And the other equalizer, to your point, is referendum. Districts that were able to put forward recurring referenda or operating referenda to exceed for a non-recurring basis, either one, now their per pupil could be adjusted based on voter approval. So this is a snapshot of the current year, 23-24, within our Badger Conference. For those that aren't aware, Badger Conferences are main-minded comparables. You've got 15 districts here that are similar size. It's also the districts we compete with in our athletic programs. Within this group, huge variations. On the far left, you have the Grove, which is getting just over $15,000 per pupil. And I call this red, I just figured I'd be on message. We are at about just over $12,000. Now I'll go back to the fun colors because it's never that simple, right? This shows how within the revenue limit, those per pupil amounts are actually broken down. The blue part of each bar represents the base revenue limit per pupil each district has to operate. For that purposes, I've got two horizontal lines up here that are going to become important. That lower line, that gray line, that's that low revenue ceiling. During the 23-25 state budget, that low revenue ceiling was moved up to $11,000. So the state said that is the minimum amount all districts can work with when calculating their revenue limit in a given year. The orange line, again, forgive me if the colors aren't the same to you, but the orange line across the middle represents the average within this group, which is about $12,560. But within those bars, there's a lot of different things. And I apologize for the text size, but I'll go through these. Again, that blue portion is their base revenue limit. If a district has passed or is in the process of implementing a recurring referendum, those amounts get added to your base in the year they are authorized. And you mentioned something we talked about a lot last time, is that orange amount in the following year becomes your base. So it becomes blue in this situation. So if we take Monona Grove in this example, they started the year with a base revenue limit of, let's call that $11,600. Their recurring referenda this year adds, 900? I don't have the exact number, let's call it $900. So for this year, their new revenue limit is just above 13.5. Next year, and I will do this again, next year when I put this graph together, Monona will have a blue bar starting at 13.5. That's important when we compare it to a non-recurring referendum, which on here I have highlighted in this hash green color. A non-recurring referendum does not get added to the base in the following year. It is only available for the years in which it was authorized. Yes?
But to that point.
Yes.
Because a 5-year recurring referendum would be just for that 5 years, right?
No, recurring stays.
Okay, so it's in perpetuity. Are all recurring referendums in perpetuity?
Yes.
Or like a certain district of Bolton? So.
Sorry, what?
I thought that one of the voter questions was a 5-year recurring referendum, only for that 5-year period, and once, if it was non-renewed. I know recurring
Okay.
is recurring. It
Let's
happens
go
year
over that
over
again
year,
real quick. There are two types of operating referendum that we can ask the voters for. A recurring and a non-recurring referendum. A recurring referendum can be asked for a period of time. It can be 1 year, it can be 5 years, it can be 30 years if you can get past. But every year in which you add to your revenue limit using that, it becomes part of your base into perpetuity. A non-recurring referendum, for let's take us for example. We have a 5-year non-recurring referendum in place right now through 25-26 of $2.5 million each year. In 26-27, that 2.5 disappears. It gets subtracted from our bar, so to speak. So if we were to pretend in this example here, that green portion would disappear next year if it was expiring now. Does that answer your question?
Kind of, because I understand it's added to the base, but say like we have a 5-year recurring referenda,
Yes.
right? And then it's not renewed past those 5 years.
It still stays.
It still stays, and where does that money then come from? The state will reimburse for it?
No, but good question. So let's play that out for a second. So if we had a 5-year, I get theoretical, right? If we had a 5-year recurring referendum for $5 million, where we added $1 million each year, at the end of those 5 years, that $5 million would be in the base. It would become part of this blue bar. It doesn't go away. You could also have a recurring referendum for 1 year that was $5 million. And it would have $5 million in that same 1 year, and it would be added to the base in the following year instead. So you can still structure it based on a long or a short period of time, but recurring means it sticks around.
But her question was, where does the money come from the next year then?
Good question. So the money is still, this is still revenue limit. So when we talked at the beginning about that bar that shrinks and weighs like an accordion based on what the state adds to the state aid pool in the revenue limit, the portion becomes a split between state and local. Right now for us, it's still about 60-40, give or take. So in the following year, depending on how we're treated in that state budget, that could wax and wane if we added in a given year. But it's contingent on what's in the prior year, but all our 421 districts in the state did. So there's no direct funding, it's all part of the revenue limit, which becomes a split funded between state and local. Yes?
And I'm sure I missed this, but what is a non-recurring exemption versus a
yep.
non-recurring referendum?
Thank you for reminding me. So on here, you have other parts of other colored bars that we didn't talk about yet, because they are truly kind of the, I'm just gonna call them junk drawer of the revenue. Doesn't mean they're not important, but a non-recurring referenda, especially in these examples, include things like voucher expansions, declining enrollment exemptions, and a handful of others that come up through consolidation. So it happens very rarely in the state, pantheon of schools, but yeah.
That's this that you're describing.
Yes. So on this example, we have a number of yellow checked boxes that represent that. Let's pick on Watertown. Watertown has a very significant portion of non-recurring exemptions. If I were to pull up the revenue sheet right now, I can tell you with confidence, the majority of that is voucher payments. So there are students within that district that don't attend Watertown schools, but may attend a parochial school or a private school voucher or something authorized through the Office of Educational Opportunity from UW-Madison. Once the institution is cleared to be part of the voucher program, a district is told by DPI in the fall how many students reside in their district that attend these schools. And then we get this exemption on our revenue limit, which then we are ironically allowed to levy for. We have to pay for it regardless, but we levy for that portion, and then that money goes to the state, which then gets distributed to the institutions at discretion. Does that answer your question?
Why is it so complicated?
It doesn't need to be, but it is, isn't it?
Why, it's just, gets added on to over time and it's amalgamated, like, it's just a curiosity question.
Yeah, so for us, for example, Milton, if you might have noticed, we do have a portion of our bar that is yellow. We have this year just under $400,000 in voucher payments. That's up almost 100% from last year. We are required to pay that bill regardless. So does it impact your taxes? You bet it does. But it doesn't actually go to any of our kids. So, and you can see just based on this, it affects districts differently. And the reason I split it up this way for this color view is that the blue portion, notice how many districts are at that gray line were it not for these non-recurring exemptions or what have you. It's a lot, and it includes us. Our non-recurring referendum is bringing us above that line right now. But after it's gone, it would not. We were bumped up to the low revenue ceiling along with Sauk Prairie, Reedsburg, Baraboo, Beaver Dam, and Watertown during this year. Yes.
Kathy Barber, so a school like Monona Grove that has that recurring referendum that will then become part of the revenue limit for following years. So if they have a 5-year recurring referendum, would they then, on top of their new blue for next year, also have another red that's on top of that then, so they're gonna be like astronomical in a few years?
I don't have the schedules of every district in these slides, but I do have them. The one that I'm gonna be watching the most next year is Oregon. Because also, and then going back to Monona Grove, to your point, not only do they have a recurring referendum, they have a non-recurring on top of that. Did you have something, Rich?
No.
But you are correct. If it's a multi-year recurring referendum, that bar will continue to stack.
So they're gonna be over 20 next year.
Not 20, but they will be.
The red's not, is it not proportional to what it is current there?
No, it is, but it's not the same every year.
Oh,
So
okay.
sometimes it is the same, like I said before, a million.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's 6.3, 2, 1.
Okay.
Based on, maybe they have a surge in 1 year to catch up to where they want to be, and then to sustain.
Got it, okay.
Am I oversimplifying this to ask if it's simply because the
the jurisdictions have the tax base to, have this available?
Yes and no. I mean, if you compared, if we were to compare mill rates to each other, you would see a difference. Because the whole purpose of the equalization aid formula, or at least the way it was designed, was that it funnels more money to a lower property value per pupil area. I'll throw an example, a Beloit versus a Madison, where it would be almost the inverse. But this impact would still show differentiation in mill rates across it. If their tax base can absorb more of that, so if they have a larger business sector, if they have a new development going in. It used to be, when Rich was talking earlier about our change in mill rate and then the change in property growth in a given area, those percentages are pretty consistent across the state. But within a municipality, it differs greatly based on net new construction, businesses moving, or reassessments. If your assessment doesn't happen every year, it happens every 2 years, you might not notice the tax change. And the tax rate decline that we showed might have actually meant your taxes went down. But if it was a year-for-year reassessment, you probably might not even say that. But you're like, so let's take an example like Verona, Epic, huge tax base in that area. So when they have a growth in a large campus like Epic up there, yes, they absorb a large portion of that tax base when they're recalculating their budget each year. We don't have that.
We don't, and so I'm not trying to be controversial. What I'm just trying to say is, here we are, and it's not that we don't love you from my standpoint, but from a municipal standpoint, from the town of Milton, I know our budget constraints. From a fire department standpoint, I know
Yes.
our constraints. And so I'm all ears, I truly am.
Yes, your assessment's correct though. Tax base does play into how we calculate these things. With the Department of Revenue, and I mentioned this last time as well, there's a great sheet, if you really dig into the pages, that shows the change in equalized value in a given municipality from year to year. And it may not be exciting reading for everybody, but when you look at it, it really does highlight that difference. And you'll see, what did residential do throughout your entire municipality? What did commercial do? What did undeveloped land do? And there are some years where the adjustments stick out like a sore thumb. And that
Back
plays
to
a
my
big
board of review meeting last night, but anyway.
But thank you for that.
Can you go back, Ross, to slide number 14? It's the, well, I'll let you know, two more.
That one?
Nope, hold on. That one.
Okay.
Yeah. And this gets at that a little bit, because we looked at our equalized valuation growth, and that's tied to two different things. It's tied to new businesses and new homes going up, but it's also tied to increased value in the current homes. But that really plays, that and the levy are the two moving pieces to that mill rate. To each individual's property tax, it's dependent on what's our levy, our school district's levy, and what's your property value compared to the overall property value of the school district.
Right.
One of the things that we try to do is keep that as stable as possible. You can see that it went up to this 926 after we passed the capital referendum back in spring of 2019. That increased the mill rate because it increased the, that's on that other slide, but our overall revenues went up from that. But every year since then, it's gone down, and we try to manage that. I think you're spot on that. From one community to the next, there's going to be large differences in how property rich that district is, and that's oftentimes tied to the business community and having large businesses. Ross referred to Epic in Verona as a great example, but it's also tied to the value of homes in that property too. What we don't want to do is have a community where our property values are rapidly decreasing because nobody wants to live here because we have a poor school district. So there's value to our community members, even if they don't have kids in school, there's value to our community members in us having a strong school district. They're creating employees for our businesses, they're creating neighbors for our families that live here. But we also want to make sure that we're balancing the things that we do well and the ability to do those things well with being as fiscally responsible as we can.
Yes.
So I got a macro level question for you. just out of curiosity. From the first session to this session, what I hear you describing is kind of an inefficient, almost broken system within state funding to schools.
I would agree with that.
That's what I hear you saying. Yeah.
I might categorize it as inadequate.
Okay, yeah. And under that assumption that the majority of school districts in the state of Wisconsin are feeling pain because of it. Now, of course, there's probably a small 10-20% that is benefiting in some way, the inadequate system.
I would argue for those that can continuously pass referendum, especially those that keep adding bars like that in orange. Yes, it's fine.
Yeah.
That gets down to the local control aspect that gets said over and over at the high level.
But this is something that has been going on for several decades now.
Correct?
And I know, and I mean, I shouldn't say I know, I think I remember there's been several times where I know bridges went up to the state capitol to speak on budgets and stuff like this. I assume for this purpose. Is there anything in the works for a different system?
I would sure like to think so. To be honest, the reason I'm actually so passionate about talking about this kind of stuff is I think the model that exists can work if it's maintained. The way it was originally designed, I mean, I'm not saying it was perfect, but when you have a commitment to 2/3 funding at the state level where all shared revenues can be predictably shown based on how they maintain the revenue limit year over year, there's some consistency in that. And if it's not what we need, at least we know what's coming. When we have inconsistencies in that, when we go back to the slide Rich wanted, the per pupil increase, when we have again, this only has a 5-year view, but I can take this all the way back to 2009. Which, well, to be fair, then let's look at it this way. This is what happened. When the model was maintained back from 93 through 2009, and this is only the red bullet portion, mind you, we had some idea what to expect. The original model said that in 1993, every district would get $200 per pupil indexed to inflation, contingent on what their enrollment is doing. So it equalized itself over time. When we hit 2009, again, I don't want to get into the political part of this, you can see what districts have had to do since that point. Now, there's some to be argued that when this happened, some costs were removed from school districts, but I'd argue that doesn't mean other things didn't continue to increase. And even though inflation has been the worst in the last couple of years, it certainly wasn't zero in 2010.
One other thing on that, it doesn't show here because you have the orange and orange continuing.
Yeah.
But from 93 to 2009, those dots are blue and orange.
Yes, this is showing where they did.
The revenue limit and per pupil aid was tied to inflation, so it kept going up at a steady rate.
Yes.
And it really gets at Derek's question, can this system work? It was working pretty well. You got inflation, every school district got inflationary costs. If your enrollment was going up, you get more revenue with that increasing enrollment. If your enrollment was declining, you wouldn't get as large increases, but you could also make some savings when your enrollment declines. But when that revenue limit per pupil aid was no longer tied to those inflationary increases, then you see that inflation continues to grow. And when those increases are smaller or non-existent, then that's that 3,300. If you flip to that next slide, it shows this is the accumulation of all of that from 2009. So those amounts that were under inflation over time have led to about a 3,300 per pupil gap between what our revenue would be if it had continued to be tied to inflation and what it actually is.
So I want to circle back to that. My question is there anything that you are aware of any modifications or anything in the works of it, or is the system just is what it is at this point?
Unfortunately, the latter. It really does come down to when these started to diverge back in 2009. That's when, at the state level, the annual change to things like state aid appropriations in the state budget were actually more of a budget consideration than a commitment to a funding plan. So when they couldn't maintain their 2/3 funding, they said, well, this is gonna start to look really bad if we don't also change something else. So they started suppressing and holding down revenue limits so that their share appeared to stabilize, but it just meant that over time, we were dealing with every 2 years, what was the state going to inject into that formula? So, no, I'm not aware of any new formula being proposed, and we're 30 years out from the original model going in place. Yes?
Just to cap on what you're saying.
Yeah.
This model was tested to the state Supreme Court and it was deemed constitutionally sound. So that's part of.
I'm not saying it's not constitutionally sound, I'm saying that it's.
No, what
safe.
I'm trying to say is that while we have these discrepancies, there's been many discussions that have occurred over the past 20 years even of trying to adjust the equalization aid model, but the only way that we can test it is in the court law. So if the legislature tries to change the equalized value adjustments in a budget or through a bill or a piece of legislation, somebody can come in and challenge that, and then it would be up to the courts to make that determination, because what is currently in place is constitutionally sound.
I would argue, yes, that it's legal, that doesn't mean it's working.
Right, I'm not that, but I'm just saying that if there are changes, there's going to be pushback on either side.
Yes.
Yes, if you go back to the slide that has our last 5 years and next year's.
This one?
That one,
Yeah.
yeah. A question was asked about what do we anticipate moving forward? And here we have next year's budget. Our school board will be approving our.
I'm sorry, just to pause you, that is current year, that's not next year.
That's current year. Our school board at our next board meeting will be approving our budget for next year. And we're bringing to the board a balanced budget for next year. Our deficits will come into place the following year. And then the year after that, when our $2.5 million non-recurring referendum expires, we're anticipating about $4 million in deficits, starting with, it would be the 26-27 year. When you start forecasting out that far, there's always some assumptions that you make, and the biggest one is always around what's the legislature going to do. We have built in for this year and for next year $325 in per pupil funding. Beyond that, there's still some questions about if the legislature will make any changes. You may recall the news articles about Governor Evers vetoing or line item vetoing a proposal from the legislature that built in that $325 in increased spending for the next 400 years. That is law right now. The legislature could change that, obviously, and they probably will, because it isn't what they had intended. But then Governor Evers has the ability to, again, veto what they bring. So there's all kinds of uncertainty. One of the things that we do know is that these 2 years where it was zero, and the state chose to use ESSER money to fund the schools for those 2 years, corresponded with the highest rates of inflation that we've seen in my memory. 11% inflation and 8% inflation. So our costs as a school district were going up as we were getting no new revenue. And we don't need to go back to the slide that has that difference between where we would be and where we are. But even with the 325, you see on that slide that that's below what inflationary costs are expected to be for the coming year. So we know that we have an upcoming issue that's going to need to be solved in one of two ways. Unless the legislature comes up with additional revenue, and the history of that is that they haven't kept up with inflationary costs. So unless they do, we are either going to need to make substantial reductions to our expenses, or we're going to need to ask our local voters and taxpayers for additional revenue. So that's something that the board will be weighing over the next month or so. A decision on whether we bring an operating referendum to the voters this November will need to be made by the first board meeting in August. So coming up between now and early August. That'll be a conversation that we'll be having at the school board level. At our next meeting with this group, our next community focus group, we want to talk a little bit more about those future budgetary challenges, about what impact that would have if we need to reduce up to $4 million in our current expenses, what impact that would have on our students and staff and opportunities, and what estimated impacts of a potential referendum would look like, and get some good conversation with this group about different types of referendum, what might be some possible options that the school board can and will be considering.
Yes.
I just have one final question. Have you guys received any communications from DPI with the MPS referenda?
I personally, yes, I have.
Okay.
Do you want to explain?
What's your question?
Well,
explain
because
to the group?
in the legislative fiscal bureau documents that I've been reading, it's going to be a significant impact on all school districts outside of MPS.
Correct.
And so I just wanted to see if the communications have been coming out, because now you have the other fallout that's happening at MPS, and is that going to stall out their referenda based off of
Very
all
fair
of these
question.
moving?
Ross, do you want to give a
Yeah.
high-level overview of what that topic is? Because many aren't-
Thank you so much, Brandon. So let's talk about what she, Heather's referencing. MPS just passed a rather large
It's
referendum.
Milwaukee Public Schools.
Milwaukee Public Schools, excuse me, in the spring, that is going to be an implementation over the next couple of years. Back to an earlier question about how referendums are structured, they didn't get everything in 1 year. Shortly after they passed their referendum, there was a lot of discussion about the reductions they were also making for the coming year, and people prioritized, wait a minute, we just approved a huge referendum, a historic referendum for MPS, and you're cutting how many positions, right? Not gonna go into that, but Heather's point is fair. What is this going to do statewide when we talk about shared revenues? Because how much a district spends in a given year feeds directly back into what that split looks like. And MPS is a big rock when you compare it to the rest of state revenues. The difference for next year is state aid is delayed a year. So as they start to implement their first year of the referendum this fall, whatever they spend in 24-25 will impact aid calculations beginning in 25-26. So yes, that is an ongoing discussion that is going to impact all districts and somehow, because they have one of the lowest property values per student in the area. And when they spend more in the state formula, they get more state aid.
And they're already one of the highest funded
Yes,
state
State
in aid
yes,
as
that's
it
accurate.
is.
That's accurate. I'm sorry, was there another part that I missed?
Just that there's communication coming from DPI, or is there
Not
going to
as
be a
much as
delay? Is there going to be a delay? Because like I said, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau did put out that memo that kind of just gave like the scenarios, and
Yes.
it looks like it's going to significantly impact majority of the schools outside of
Yes.
Milwaukee.
Now, there are things that can be done to mitigate that impact, but you are correct. There are regular discussions going on with DPI in districts, in my professional organization, so that is definitely a hot topic.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry, you've been very patient, Mike. What's up?
Mike Barron, I'd like to, for the next meeting, will you guys be providing alternatives to a referendum?
Yeah, are there specific
Well,
things that you have in mind?
Yes, consolidated elementary school. That would be an alternative.
I would
yes.
say, when I spoke earlier to either reducing our costs or asking the voters for additional revenues, that
Well, that's what I'm hoping.
would fall under the reducing our costs.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's all. I'm just looking for, are there going to be alternatives to the referendum? Because I'd like to hear that.
I will preface that by saying, are we going to be bringing a detailed list of $4 million of things that we can cut tomorrow? No. But if we want to talk about big pieces, that can be a topic. I will tell you that the cost to run consolidated is less than the deficit we're talking about,
Considerably less.
considerably less.
So it's a solid option.
It is an option.
Yep. Yeah, I'm just
Yeah,
asking.
that's fine, that's fine. Anything else for the good of the time? I know you stuck with us till 8 o'clock on a very hot night. But I do appreciate the dialogue and the questions. Rich, anything else?
I want to thank you all again. 2 weeks from tonight, we have our third session. We hope to see you all here. If you're not available, but you want to provide some input, definitely reach out with any questions or thoughts that you have between now and then. So thank you all for your time.
I know, right?
No, I.